essentially different ways to get sounds with multiple amps. Okay. So, you know, I think we spoke about in another video, I arrived somewhat early on that I couldn't get the sound that I wanted, that I was hearing out of one amp, you know? So I was always searching for that one amp you could channel switch, and it just sounded like a, you know, a lot of stuff I was doing on guitar was classic rock stuff. So that Fender stuff with tremolo, with a really good reverb, the, you know, nice semi-clean to semi-clean stuff. And then the Marshall, you know, the tone Marshall, of classic rock, you know. So I started way back with, I mean, we've talked about all this, but the PV Renown 400, which was, you know, okay.
But one sound.
One sound.
Yeah.
So
like I said, it was channel switching though, right?
It was, and the clean was ultra clean. It was a serviceable clean. The reverb was okay, spring reverb. The distortion was not great, but then I started experimenting with pedals. So, you know, like a lot of us in classic rock again, went through the tube screamers, had an 808, had a TS9, had a whatever the later version with the plastic on it was. I think they also called it a TS9 or maybe DS. No, DS was the distortion, but had a DS1, had an OD1, had a.
Did you have a Rat at all?
Had a Rat. Yeah. That got stolen along with my bass gear. For some reason, I think the guitar player was experimenting with using that. But yeah, the Rat and my TS at that time, it was probably a early 80s TS9. That's gone, early 80s Rat. My wah made it, which you're using.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's my wah from the early to mid 80s. But anyway, so of course you start off, and who can afford 2 amps, right? When you're starting off. So you try to do the best you can with pedals, and that's what we did. So I'd borrow something, like I did some recordings, I remember in high school, and this dude had a Korg. It was like a modular effects unit. You could plug different, I think it took either 3 or 4 effects, and he had a delay, a chorus, a compressor, and a distortion.
Something
and I
on
used
the ground?
that. Yeah, and you could actually plug, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 others, so there might have been 6 possible modules you can put in. And I have no recollection of what it was, but we used that on the guitar, and then we went back and used it on the vocals too, and I remember messing with the delay and everything. But then I got to, okay, this amp isn't working well. I blew that one up because I was using the bass through it. Then I said I need something, and wound up with a solid state Yamaha GS 100. A buddy of mine, Ken, had, and I traded a couple things for it. And then I think long story short, I kind of owed him money on it for like ever. Okay. And then we talked in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And I said, man, I'm sorry, I said, I'll PayPal you some money. He said, don't worry about it. You know, it was an inexpensive amp, but it was one of those things where I kind of thought I had given, but I didn't. I mean, I think I gave him like some horrible trade, like a wah and something else. And yeah, he definitely got the short end of stick. So sorry again.
Sorry, dude.
Great guitar player too, Ken. And in fact, he's the one that was in Atlanta and played with guys you grew up with. A guy I grew up with in Connecticut ends up in Atlanta playing with guy he grew up with in Florence.
Small world, man.
Strange. So I used that amp for a while with a Rockman sustainer and a Yamaha rack unit.
So the amp was set up clean, and the sustainer was the dirt. And
sustainer was the dirt and that super compressed sounding, ultra crisp clean, and all that jazz. And I had wired the 3-position foot switch from my PV. I cut the DIN plug off the end of that, and then used the leads from each of the switches, put 1/4 inches on those, and used it to switch the Rockman.
Wow.
So I had an awesome plastic foot switch for that. So, but then I got this, Tyler got me, he bought a Yamaha, it was a single rack space, like one of those older, it only did 1 effect at a time kind of thing. There were some patches on it that kind of did 2 effects, but it got stolen out of a bar when I was playing back home too. But
thievery.
I know. But I used that mainly for a chorusing sound, but it was really a detune, kind of like it turns out what Eddie Van Halen was doing, that detune a couple cents down and a couple cents up. and it just really fat. And I've got some stuff from the 80s on cassette that I found that I recorded that has that, and it was that very setup. It was that Yamaha amp, my Ibanez, the Yamaha multi-effects thing, and the Rockman.
Right.
So then it evolved to I had several boogies. That didn't really do it for me, and then I finally said, all right, I got to get some decent amps. I bought a Fender Twin, used that for a while, tried to get distortions that would work with that. Of course,
tough.
Yeah, not great. Twin's a great amp for a lot of things, but it's just too loud to break up and stuff. So, so then I said, all right, I'm going to buy. I got a deal on this Super Reverb. This was late 90s, early 2000s. I bought this Super Reverb. I have the 68, and then I got I said, well, I need another amp because I was back in Mudfish Jones. I said, I need something
for the dirt.
For the dirt. So I got a Top Hat and Plexador. I was looking all around for Marshalls and stuff. This one came up, and I bought that and a 212 that matched it, and gigged that with a radial headbone, I think it was called, or no, switchbone. It was just a switcher, and it had a boost, like a clean boost function. So
Nice.
You could A, B, Y, or boost. And that I used that for years.
That was a great rig, right?
Man.
Yeah.
But then I got tired of carrying
I was gonna say
two
just
big
that
amps around.
is heavy enough.
So then I went back to, okay, I got to get a channel switching amp. Never was happy with anything. Bought a Marshall JVM, and that was probably my least favorite amp of all time. And I know people get them to sound great and they love them, but I gigged it a lot, and I just, for months and months, and I just couldn't get.
And that was a
sound.
You're
Head.
playing it through that
And it had the most beautiful, I played it through the Top Hat. I played it through a 412 Fender Custom Shop 412 with vintage 30s also, so I used that. It was a little small, so the head stuck, I didn't like. The head stuck over the side a little bit. But beautiful, the most intuitive channel switch. You could it had 4 channels, and you had 6, I think, foot switches, and then you could assign it to all sorts of different things. Very intuitive, how to use it, how to program it. And that part of it was so great, brilliant. But just for me, the tones didn't work. Yeah. So then I bought the Fuchs that I have, and I do really like that. It's in it. The channel switching is great. It's still just not the same as having a Marshall and a Fender.
Right.
Long story short, I've been doing this for 40 years trying to find Marshall and Fender in one, and it didn't work.
So that leads you to getting a Marshall and a Fender.
Right. So been looking for a real Marshall. It didn't necessarily have to be a Marshall brand name, but I always gravitated towards the later 70s JMPs or JCM 800s for versatility, because you could kind of dial them back and get sort of a plexi sound if you use the lower input, and or just dial the gain back and push the master. A lot of people don't like master volume amps and all that, but you can essentially get to the same thing with this setup too, since I have the Fryette attenuator, so you can just completely turn the preamp way down, turn the master all the way up, and then attenuate it and get a pretty good plexi-ish sound. But this amp came up thanks to you and your buddy Sam, so I couldn't pass it up. It was at the right time, and I just really found that it was a great deal, and so that's the amp and cab that I use now. And again, so we're going to use this to explain how you can, if you have a couple of amps, and in this case, we're going to talk about mostly 3 amps. And it's not super practical for people that are going to be,
right.
unless you have
You're
roadies or cartage and all that. I mean,
you're talking about having a hassle having
we're
2
not
amps.
I would not take this to a club gig. I mean, that's just, I don't want to be that guy, but. Even taking 2 amps is kind of, every time I do it, I was like, yeah, somebody's going to be like, man, look at this guy with his, got to have his fancy amps and stuff. But it's not that. It's having the sound to be inspired, and everybody gets inspired in different ways.
Right.
And that's another thing I want to talk about here too, because we're going to do some of this with, quote, traditional pedals, but a lot of it I'm finding much, much easier with my Fractal AxeFx FM3. The routing, it makes all the routing simpler. You can do multiple routings because it's got multiple ins and outs. It just, you don't have to go through the head scratching nightmare of, you saw all the stuff I was trying to draw out, trying to figure out how I could switch all the amps and do all this with a couple of A/B switches, and you can do all that internally in the AxeFx. I'm not using amp modeling and stuff in these patches. It's just in front of the amp, it's using modulation stuff, and then going with the wet, dry, wet, or wet, dry, it's using reverb and delay only to the wet amps in stereo. So you basically having a mono signal going to the dry amp, and then a stereo signal that is only 100% wet, reverb, and delay.
And that's where, if we back up again, where my unorthodox approach to guitar, like I got smitten with the idea of stereo real early. And I think it was just because I had a Rockman. I had actually a Rockman.
So like X100?
Yeah. And headphones on, and it's just like huge, and then you get, and I wanted that sound. And so I ended up eventually getting 2 amps. It basically was like a solid state power amp and 2 cabinets. And so it was just this big wide spread, and it was just awesome. Maybe not the best tone in the world, but I
remember, you had were they 212s?
No, they were 2 412s. But
I don't remember that set. I was picturing you had 2 212s.
Eventually had that. Okay. Yeah. But the first thing early on, was 2 412s, and I'd put one on either side of the stage, and so that it was just like this big wash across, and I just really loved that because it was real immersive.
So that was Rockman Sustainer, or that was the.
Yep. This was still just the little Rockman.
Really?
Yeah. Yep.
So you did like a Y cable coming out of it?
And put
or
it
did it have a stereo output?
No, it was just out of the headphone. Then I just had to Y cable it up.
And what effects were you using?
There's chorus on there, and that's it. And I would it wasn't much switching at that point. It was just like one sound, and it's whatever. But it's still, what kept driving me back to that stuff was the stereo-ness of it all. And this to me is like, fast forward all the way to today, this is the best of both. It's the real sounds. It's a real Marshall sound, but it's that stereo sweep that once you hear it, man, it's hard to not have it.
The more I've seen people do this on YouTube and stuff, and you don't get it sounds great on recordings, right? But it's an in the room thing to me because it doesn't translate. Because it sounds good. Okay, I get the stereo. Okay, I can hear ping ponging when I record this. But to be here and you've got the immediacy of the dry amp, and it's not, there's nothing lost in reverb, there's nothing that gets soft or spongy or whatever.
Exactly.
The delays aren't cluttering up your sound, so it's a very, very clean thing. So there's this going on, and then there's this going on here, and
it's really hard to capture that recorded.
Yeah, so it's almost like the difference between going to a live concert and then listening to that concert. It's great when it's recorded, but it's just not the same.
Right.
And again, we're playing at neighbor disturbing volumes here. Luckily, my neighbors he's one of my neighbors on this side.
I'm good.
The other side is a guy that's lived there for as long as we've been here, 28 years, and he's never complained. So good neighbor, Kenny.
Shout out to Kenny.
Never called the cops on me, and I've played lots of loud music and continue to do so. But some of the concerns you have with multiple amp setups can be addressed in several ways. One of them is phase, and then like ground loops. So you can have hum, you can have all this, and I'll talk about that. I've got a unit that addresses both of those because I was having it was mostly ground loop noise, and these amps are old that I'm using, most of them, so they're noisy inherently, but they were a lot more noisy than they should have been. So I got a device to combat that. So it can flip the phase and it can lift the ground. Now you have to have one of your amps has to be grounded, an earth ground. So people try to use those plugs with the ground lift on them and stuff. And you don't do that with all of your amps. It's not safe to do it. Like my 68 Super Reverb, when I got it, had the 2-prong plug. I had it modded because literally the first time I used it, I got shocked. So, I mean, it's not a matter of, am I going to get shocked? You will get shocked if you use it in a microphone, or if you use it and touch something else on your, on a PA system, somebody else's amp, you touch a string on your buddy's guitar or whatever. And it's not like your lip. I got shocked against a mic, and it stings, and it's not great. But so anyway, yeah, grounding is important both for safety and for humming, not having hum, and having a common ground. You can lift the ground of some of the other ones, but keep it grounded. You stay safe and make sure it sounds right. And again, I'll address that in this. Having your amps that you're running plugged into the same circuit, into the same plug, is also somewhat important, because if it's on a different leg, it can have. You can introduce noise if it's on a different leg, if you're the circuit. So a lot of times if you're in a club or something, you might have two adjacent plugs, and one of them's on one leg, one's on, and that can cause problems and stuff. So anyway, not that most people would use this setup anyway. This is a fun thing for geek guitar people that want to rock out really loud and have it sound great. But so like you said, to me, stereo and or wet, dry, wet is absolutely the way to go. And or just the 2 amp setup, we can talk about that too, which is what I used for many years, is good, but it's not as enveloping as this, and not as 360 and 3-dimensional, or all those terms people like to use. But
all right, we can check it out.
We'll check it out.
Let's check it out.
Now we're sitting in front of the rig. Basically, what this setup is I can dynamically switch between the wet, dry, wet, which consists of left side wet is a Friedman Runt 20, top hat 2x12 with vintage 30s, and the 1968 Super Reverb on the right with 4 CTS speakers that I recently had reconed. There's another video on that. So the signal path I'll put up on the screen here. It's the guitar goes into this first pedal board on this side, which consists entirely of fuzzes, boosts, a wah, and overdrive. So won't be using those too much. I might kick on the Seymour Duncan pickup booster or the boost line driver, and potentially the Wampler Bell, which is a clone of the ODR1, which is a German pedal that was cheap back in the 90s, and then it got discontinued, got really expensive because a bunch of guys in Nashville found out they liked it. So it goes from here into the pedal board that's got the boosts, the fuzzes, and the wah. And then it goes into the input of the AxeFx. It goes through a few modulation effects that you can turn on or off. I'll talk about those in a little bit. Then it goes out of the output number 2 directly into the front of the Marshall, into the high input of the Marshall. Now, the Marshall speaker output then goes into the input of the power station attenuator, and then the speaker output of the attenuator goes into the Marshall. So again, that signal path, the front end dry signal path, is guitar, distortion, fuzz, and wah, Marshall, and then power station, and then into the Marshall cabinet.
And that's that immediate sound.
That's your immediate, your dry sound. Then what happens, the power station has that full signal, and it has a line out. So the line out of that then comes back into the AxeFx input number 1, and then that drives reverb and delay, and it splits that, those are both in stereo, splits those into the Friedman and the Super Reverb on the left and right. And those are 100% wet. You could also call it a kill dry signal, so you're not getting any of the dry signal. So we got the Marshall, and then I do have a Ernie Ball volume pedal that controls the signal that's going into the wet side. It controls both of those amps, so I can fade in or out the wet parts. So that's full up on the wet. And I usually use it sparingly. So we'll put a little boost on that signal. So you can kind of see where you're not losing the character of what you're doing. The brunt of the signal is there, and you know, even when I push the volume pedal all the way down, meaning all the delay and reverb you can get, it's still pretty clear.
Again, you got to be in the room almost because it sounds so good. It kind of like wraps around.
And that's way more reverb and delay than I would use.
Right,
but
sure.
That's more like what I would use if So that's with the Marshall preamp around 6, master at 4, treble at about 4, middle 5 to 6, bass is 6, and presence is down to 3 or 4. So, and the other amps are set fairly clean. Yeah, I can demo what the 2 side amps only. So this is going to be stereo with just some reverb on the Friedman and the Super Reverb only in stereo. And some vibrato. I've got an expression pedal that controls the reverb. The reverb is coming from the Fractal at this point, because my reverb on my Super Reverb is not working properly, so. That's just with some trem. We can turn that off, and then just kind of the amps with a little bit of reverb. Stereo. And then kind of the power of having a system like this, we can pretty easily switch to something with some multi-tap delays and just a lot of different sounds easily. So this is kind of a fusion clean sound. Then you could go to a 80s tape clean or 70s. And again, that's this board into the line boost, and then into the FM3, and then splitting into the top hat and the Fender. And then the beauty of this, again, you can just switch right back to that wet, dry, wet, wet, dry, wet. So at your feet is just being able to switch between that and just a clean 2-amp stereo rig. And then I can switch to the Super Reverb only. Or the Friedman.
That's a great example of that fuzz, which is so lovely coming from here.
Yep.
But if it was all smeared around, it would be nasty.
Mm-hmm.
But man.
So all washed out and flubby and awesome. Then you throw a little bit of effects around it.
Just to show that you can do all this with just a couple of pedals too. You don't have to have a fancy setup with a modeling, you know, effects rig or anything.
I imagine that would be pretty intimidating looking for.
Yeah, and I mean, just to have all this, you don't need all this. There's a couple of things you need. You have to have, in order to get the true wet, dry, wet with kill dry, which means you're not getting your original signal in your wet, you have to have pedals that are capable of only passing wet signal through. So what I've got here is a TC Electronic Alter Ego X4, which is a kind of one of their units meant to emulate some of the older tape units, and like the Benson Echo Rec, like Echoplex, and some of the like the Roland Space Echo. It's got settings for those. And then I'm using a Strymon Blue Sky, both of which, they're both stereo effects, and they are both capable of 100% wet, which is what you're going to hear here. So the signal path of this, once I switch it over, is the same front end pedal board with the distortion effects, the boost effects, and the wah. And then it goes from there into the modulation, which is a Keeley mod workstation. It's got several different effects. I think I've got it set up for a chorus and a detune, pitch detune. Then it goes into a tremolo, then the Digitech Expression Factory pedal, I couldn't remember the name, which is I've used in the past for Leslie simulation. It's also got a whammy effect, which I almost never use. It's got a weird like synth swell thing, just some things, just to demonstrate you can throw different stuff in front of these amps. And then
No
it goes
fractal.
no fractal at all.
nothing.
And
Okay.
so then it's going to come out of there and go directly into the Marshall, same as before, then into the power station, Marshall cabinet, and then it splits, comes back here into the Alter Ego, and then into the Blue Sky, and then splits out into the Friedman and the Super Reverb. One thing I forgot to mention, I said we did have something to counteract the effects of both phase reversal and ground. I've got a radial stage bug, I believe it's the SB6. So the outputs from the Fractal and from the pedal board here, the analog pedal board that are going to the stereo rigs, go through that first, so I can flip the phase on one or the other of the amps. I can flip phase on either amp, and I can lift ground on either amp too. So basically, if you have a problem with ground hum or phase problems, you can, like I said, you can lift on either or both of those, and you can reverse phase. So basically all three of your amps need to be in phase. It'll sound different. Maybe you like that sound.
Right,
but,
right. It gives you options.
Yeah, you got lots of options. It's not necessary, but it is helpful to have something that does that. The Fractal allows you to flip phase as well, but it doesn't allow you to lift ground individually, and it doesn't allow you to flip phase on the left and the right outputs of one of its outputs. So this gives me a little bit more flexibility in both. So I'm going to switch these over. It's a matter of switching 3 or 4 cables, and then we're going to be on the analog rig. All right, so now we're switched over to the board with the regular pedals, no AxeFx at all. So I'll put the diagram up on the screen of exactly how it's working. And I can just demonstrate some of this. What I've got on here is I've got my Fuzzface on, my favorite guitar to use with Fuzz, which is my G&L Legacy, because it's got the passive treble and bass. Talk about that in another video too. The reason that's helpful for Fuzz. Then it goes into the modulation workstation by Keeley, tremolo, Boss, your regular old green TR2, the Expression Factory by Digitech into the Marshall, out from the power station, and then back into the Alter Ego, and then the Blue Sky, and then you get this. So same thing. I've got the Ernie Ball that's going to feed my dry or my wet amp. So here's just dry only. Add some of that effect in. And kind of a really dense delay. And I still got that fuzz face on, but that's one of the beautiful things about a fuzz is you turn your volume down and you get that super clean and you retain all your highs. So right now, the only things you're hearing are the distortion of the Marshall, the reverb, from the Blue Sky and the Alter Ego delays. And I'm going to add a phase effect from the Expression Factory.
Still a fuzz face.
Yep, still the fuzz, just a little chorus on it now. And just down, and now I'm going to turn my bass up. All right, you're up. Who says you need humbuckers to rock?
Right?
One disadvantage to this pedal setup right now is without having the delay and reverb in parallel, if you shut off the first effect, which in this case happens to be the delay, you shut them both off because remember it's kill dry. So that means the dry signal is not going through that. It hits that, it delays it, and only the delay signal's going. So if you turn off the delay, nothing gets to the reverb. So I'll show you that real quick. So show it with the turn up the delay a little. So if you're then you shut that off, it's gone. No more reverb or.
So that's just the Marshall.
Right.
Yeah.
But I hit that, now I've got reverb and delay. So what you would have to do in that case is the way that I've got the reverbs and delays routed in the AxeFx is in parallel to the original signal. So you're getting your, you'd get it, they're in parallel to each other. So you get one, you can get one or the other, but they're both delivering just the wet, just the wet signal. So
And you can show that on the little diagram.
yeah, I'll show that on the diagram. But like I said, if I had, I think there's some companies out there that make devices that'll do that for you. It's just another little pedal. Some of your loopers will do that. Not like a looper that plays back loops, but a loop that you put effects into. You can do that. I believe there's a way you could wire it that way. There's Gig Rig makes something called the Wetter Box. That's a parallel effects unit. And then there's effects switchers that afford that functionality too, where you would put all of your pedals in different loops, and then you can make them either in series or in parallel. So that would let that work for delays and stuff. So like I say, there's this. It seems kind of simple, like, oh, I'll just throw some effects together and throw 3 amps, but there's a lot of considerations. Like I said, from the order of effects, which is a completely different conversation.
Right,
like, how,
right.
oh, I'm not going to put my fuzzes before this or whatever. I always put my fuzzes first because I know fuzzes don't play well with other stuff. In fact, my wah, I sent off to a guy named Dave Fox in New Jersey who puts a special buffer inside it, so it will work better with fuzzes. I mean, they didn't have that technology back in the day. Hendrix and whoever back at Tony Iommi, whoever, they just put it the way it worked best. But with this particular circuitry and this, you can use this wah pedal either before or after a fuzz, and it works fine. Nice. Fuzzes don't like to see stuff in front of them. Like they don't want to have a distortion pedal or whatever, and sometimes they don't like something after it either. So they're finicky. So having them in their own loop and first is great. But so I have all my fuzzes first, of which I've got 4 now on this board. But then my overdrives and boosts come after that, and the wah comes directly after the fuzz. But in all of that, in something like an AxeFx, doesn't really matter because they're models, number one. But you can just go into the screen and switch them around, change them around, and here I've got them. You have to wire them all differently and all that. Again, if you get a really good looper where you can plug all your loops into it, like Boss makes one, Voodoo Labs makes one. There's several. The Gig Rig, the guys that do that pedal show on YouTube, that he makes a really great one that does just about everything you could want, and you can have almost AxeFx level switching with conventional effects. And I think the Boss unit, maybe it's not Boss Digitech. Somebody, I'll put a link up there, but there's a couple of decent units out there. But I think the Gig Rig G3 looks like probably the best thing out there. I don't have one, but everything I need to do, I can do with the AxeFx. But like I say, I wanted to demonstrate that you can do just about all that with a fairly simple pedal board. Like you could have just one distortion, and then you could have a delay and a reverb for your wet, and then whatever modulation effects you have, tremolo, whatever, go before it. And so it doesn't have to be super complicated. But here it's very complicated because we've got, I don't know how many pedals and I don't all this junk, but I've just kind of thrown this together for this because I've collected a lot of pedals over a lot of years, and a lot of these were sitting in a cabinet, and I've got some more, but I do want to have another video about fuzz pedals and the different types and how they work with different guitars, and so we'll do that. But
we'll do that in another video because
it's
so hot.
It is very hot in here.
And we gotta go.
Yep. Anyway, be good.